Hi, everyone. I'm Dale Bingham. I'm one of the coordinators here for the Chumash Indian Museum in Thousand Oaks. I've had the pleasure of coordinating and planning the museum speaker series program for the last couple of years now. This year and last year is a little different. Due to COVID, like many other places, our museum has faced difficult challenges. Last March, we closed our doors to the public and postponed all of our planned events for the year. Again, like many others, we had to figure out how we would go about engaging with the public in this new virtual climate. Fortunately, we were incredibly lucky to receive a CARE grant through the National Endowment for the Humanities that has helped us fund our virtual programs, including this one. With grants, unfortunately, funding has to come to an end, and we would like to continue to bring these important topics and voices to all who are interested through our speaker series program. Due to the funding issues brought on by the pandemic and the museum's closure, we're struggling to find the funds to continue with our speaker series events for this year. And that's why small donations from our viewers are really important and mean the world to us. Even a $5 donation can help us raise the funds to continue this program and book more speakers. Supporting our small museum gift shop is a great way to help us raise the funds needed. Please consider purchasing a book, cards, masks, t-shirts, or many of the other gifts we offer in our online shop. I'll post the donation information in the chat box and the Q&A box below, and all of this information can be found on our website at shumashmuseum.org. And now on to tonight's presentation. For all of you tuning in, we will have a Q&A session after the presentation. So as we continue on, please feel free to submit your questions or comments. If you're using Zoom, please type the questions into the chat box below. And if you're joining us via Facebook Live, feel free to comment and we'll make sure those comments make their way onto the Zoom box for them to see. And for our speakers tonight, we at the museum are very grateful to have Nakia Zavalla and Wendy Teeter here with us tonight, covering such an important topic. Nakia Zavalla is a cultural director from the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. Wendy Teeter is a senior curator of archaeology at the Fowler Museum, UCLA's Repatriation coordinator and lecturer at UCLA American Indian Studies. And I'll go ahead and turn this over to them now.
Haku everyone. Haku maktuka Nakia Zavalla, kalapalahulapu, ikalawashak. My name is Nakia Zavalla. She had said earlier, I'm from Kalawashak, which is the village here, which my tribe, the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, mainly comes from. I am the Culture and Language Director, and I work under our Elders Council and have been brought in to do some of this very important work of repatriation and learning more about NAGPRA and the process and how we as Indian people should be utilizing this law to ensure that we're able to get our ancestors back and be able to do this critical work of reentry and having appropriate representation with the different institutions. Wendy?
Thank you, Nakia, and thank you, Chumash Indian Museum, for inviting us to be here tonight. We're really going to, look forward to kind of chatting a little bit about NAGPRA, and also really, I think that everybody here today is looking forward to having conversations from, hearing from Nakia and how things have been from the tribal side. So we'll be talking sort of in collaboration and in conversation, with each other and sort of remembering some of the longstanding work that's been going on and giving people the opportunity to kind of hear things from the other side.
So before we begin, we wanted to at least give an idea of where the Chumash territory covers, and I think this really shows the different villages and so many villages that are all spread out within Chumash territory. One thing to know is that we have separate languages, and so we're not one Pan Chumash people, although we do come from our ancestors tell us, the Mon Molakaku, the ancient ones, lived on the islands and they came across the ocean and they began to populate the mainland. And then they broke away into different groups, and then we had different languages. So we want to give an idea of like where we're talking about. where is Chumash territory? And to the south, it goes as far as Malibu. It goes out into the Channel Islands and includes the Southern Islands as well. And all the way up to San Luis Obispo and inland to the San Joaquin Valley. So when we talk about the work that we're doing, this is the area that we are covering, and also being respectful to those tribes that are from Chumash tribes that are in those respected areas. So where I come from specifically is Samala Chumash, the village of Kalawashak, and you will see that somewhat in the middle area, closer to the ocean. I don't know if our cursor can show them anything, I'm not sure. So that's specifically where I'm coming from, but that also doesn't mean that people in my community don't represent other villages, as there were intermarriages, and we have families that are connected to more villages besides Kalawashak. But we are specifically standing as Band of Chumash Indians. And we want to give some context of our people and what they look like, and some very special ancestors to us. To the left is Maria Solaris, that is my 5th great grandmother, and also the informant to J.P. Harrington, where we have a lot of very important cultural and language information that she left behind. So, you know, it's amazing. She had a vision, right? She knew, like, whatever she told this man, it was going to continue, and it was going to be passed down to her, to the different generations of our tribe. So she is Samala Chumash, Ynez Chumash is the same. And the middle picture are some more of our ancestors, really her daughters and herself on the right side. And then we have Raphael Solaris in both of the pictures. You'll see him off to the left in a bear fur. We also are from the Bear Clan. And then off to the right is his picture that he had taken with traditional regalia, Chumash regalia. He was our very last Wat, our traditional chief of our tribe. So when we talk about our culture, that picture of him really is something we really love to have up, because it is a time when, you know, the people were colonized, and we're moving on from one time to another, and he's still the last chief that represents our culture intact in traditional ways.
So when we're talking about why we have such laws like cultural resource laws and NAGPRA, we really are sort of talking about recognizing that people have been removed from the landscape, that that these native people from the Chumash area, but from all over, were really struggling with a colonial agenda that was seeking to remove any sign, any connection between Native people and the landscape, in this sort of understanding of manifest destiny, that you have this sort of right to have the land as colonial settlers from the East Coast to the West Coast. And in that erasure, all of those ancestors that Nakia just shared, and the territory that she also shared, was gobbled up by the early Spanish land grants. And then we have the Mexican period, and then we have the US period, with more and more people coming west and then occupying those lands, digging up and removing or paving over all of the people there, so that as a museum person, what we really see is those museum institutions are being created in order to become relics. All of the ancestral ancestors and their belongings become relics of the past. And so when we're, again, sort of thinking about in the museum, what we're talking about is holding on to these items, and Native people, as Nakia is starting to talk about, or hopefully will respond in a second, can no longer access them, can no longer interpret them, can no longer be in relationship with either her ancestors' physical forms or those items.
Right, and as we learn more of our culture and our languages, I mean, not too long ago, I was able to actually see a deer bone tibia whistle. You know, we've read about it, but to actually see those objects and to study them and to see how they're created is so important to us in this critical work of reclaiming our traditional ways of life. And you know, our grandmother Maria Solaris, she left lots and lots of notes, but when we can actually see some of the objects that she's describing, and knowing that we didn't have access to those or really know that those existed, is really troublesome, and it's heartbreaking. And you know, that's the wonderful work that I do under my elders council is, you know, we are ensuring that those things are coming back to the tribe. We're ensuring that we have access to them, and we're part of that narrative, you know, instead of someone else writing it about us, that we are part of that. You know, it's so important that our voices are heard. It's so important that we're part of this process, and we're also made a priority when those items are available for us to go and study, and really most importantly that those items can come back home. And especially with this topic of NAGPRA, you know, those were taken without permission. Those were taken in a very unsacred way, and the desecration of those graves is very hurtful. And you know, NAGPRA is fairly new, as we'll get more into it, and Wendy will explain. And when I think about the 1930s, or I think about the 1920s, and you know, actually maybe 1940s as well, right, Wendy? And so I think about those times of it's like a lawless time, and that's nothing new to Indian people. A lawless time when our rights are not, we have no like rights over our own burials of our people. It's very hurtful. And I think what's another troubling area is that these places of high level respect of educational institutions allowed for this to happen, and that they're being housed in these institutions, and the ability to actually repatriate them is hard, because we have to go through so much red tape in order for that to happen. And again, we need to be part of actually going to view. We need to be part of having those very critical conversations, and you know, not just to be a box to check off, but actually sitting at the table and having them listen to us. They need to hear what we have to say, and that's so important.
And so really, I mean, and that brings to the point that it is something fairly new, and that it wasn't that people weren't aware or watching the destruction of these ancestors going on. They just had no opportunity to stop it outside of the force of their bodies. And I remember the first Elders Council that I went to in 1998 and met with, came out to St. Ynez, and Elaine Schneider was the Elders Council chair at the time, and Choi Slow sharing some very, very deep memories that he had of standing in front of the bulldozer, and the occupation of Point Conception by so many tribal members, and all of the work that it took with really no law, no force to be able to but of will to stand in front of those bulldozers and try to prevent the desecration of those graves. And how long and how many years, decades, were people doing this work to try, even if it's just standing there, try to prevent these things from happening. So it's really not until 1990. I mean, if we think about it in those terms, like you're saying, it really hasn't been that long ago. It's 30 years, which seems like a long time, that we would expect that we would hope that it would have been done, but here we are 30 years later. But it took decades, even from the 1960s and forward, with social justice movements, to try to get those voices really heard through the Congress of American Indians, National Congress of American Indians, and all sorts of other lobbyists, people like Susan Harjo and Walter Echohawk, that were relentless and wouldn't give up before this was finally passed. And even during that time, what we see is this really big disagreement about what is NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Is it research rights? Is it an administrative law? Or is it a human right? Is this sort of getting at some of the reparation work to try to to recognize the trauma that was inflicted upon Native people by having their bodies removed from during Indian wars, from battlefields, from massacre sites that were sanctioned by the state government, and really understanding that this is built not as an ethnic issue, but as a trust relationship, right underneath treaty laws.
Mhm.
So this isn't, oh, we're going to do something nice for Native people. This is an obligation under the treaty rights, which so many, for so many years were signed. But you'll see over and over again, especially in the beginning, this idea that it was a compromise between a faction of museums that said we have to preserve these objects for future generations, and we're the only ones who could be the stewards of this. And then the sort of scientific community said that, oh, well, these folks are, once you get past a few generations, who knows, who do they belong to? And we need to know about humanity. And so we should be, have unfettered access to these ancestral remains or these human bones, because people have the right to know whatever they want to know, against tribal voices who are like, that's my grandfather, that's my great uncle that I know was taken from that field, and we don't know where he went, but we should be able to bring him home. And so in this sort of legislation, we see that not only does it require museums and in any agency that receives federal funds to complete an inventory of all ancestral remains, all human remains, and all funerary objects, but we're also supposed to protect, it's also supposed to allow for the protection of burial sites and cultural items that are found on federal land. And that's any sort of federal undertaking. You have the American Antiquities Act, but this is another law to try to bolster the protection of these really important places. And then, of course, we have, with the rise of eBay and many online auction houses, you see Native American human remains being trafficked. And so this allows for the FBI to investigate these crimes and provides a mechanism for tribes who are often watching these eBay sites to be able to say something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And just to get at this a little more about the definitions, I wanted to sort of bring apart, I wanted to bring up this idea of the perversity of having ancestors removed from the ground. Because realistically, if you think about the Geneva Convention and in times of war, it's considered to be improper, like against human rights, to desecrate a grave, even during times of war. And yet you see Native American graves desecrated every single day in order for the development of a housing project, for a minefield, whatever that is, for mining to go on, even to this day, even though it's not even allowed within other sort of forms of across the world. And in this sort of conversation, you have within the law this sort of dickering around this idea of, is it freely shed? So in the second part, if you have baby teeth, those don't have to go home under NAGPRA because they might have been freely shed or naturally shed in the course. These kinds of like teasing apart this little thing is again sort of part of this perversity that you don't see applied in other forms. It's only when we're talking about Native American bodies that this comes up. And I suppose, Nakia, and sort of talking about from the tribal standpoint, it's not just under NAGPRA that you end up having to deal with these sort of takings of human
not
bodies.
at all. Matter of fact, there has been several instances where we actually had to pick up some of our ancestors from people's homes. So it may have been like great-great-grandpa that utilized one of our ancestors as an educational piece for them to talk about in their classrooms, and or somebody that just picked something up where they shouldn't have. And, usually it's the grandparent or so passes on and they just stumble upon it in their storage. and they let us know, and that way we can repatriate, we can take our ancestors back and put them back where they belong. It's amazing, some of the very interesting situations that we have actually found our ancestors in, and also just trying to find the story out, like, well, what happened? How did this even occur? I think that's what's great about this talk through the Chumash Museum, is that I felt that more public education needed to happen. Most people don't know about NAGPRA. They also don't know that, you know, they were committing a federal offense, depending on where they picked it up at, pick the ancestors up from, and that's against the law to do that. And I think it's important that when the general public comes upon these types of findings, that they need to contact the authorities right away. That way it can be handled and taken through the appropriate process.
That's really important to know. And we see the same thing that comes up at the museum as well. And you'll hear different stories of people saying, oh, well, you know, my husband was a construction worker and he wanted to have this skull on his mantelpiece and thought it was really great, but we took really good care of it. But now we're getting older, you know, and you can't just toss these remains out. And it's just like, oh, so now that you're getting closer, you're thinking about this as being a person again. It's extraordinary what people do sometimes and what people have in their homes.
And Wendy, I want to say too, like, our people, you know, when our people were buried, they were buried with the finest things that they had. So you're not going to see these items, especially if they're deemed you know, unidentified funerary objects. It's amazing. There's no way you're going to stumble upon some of those items and like, oh, they're unidentified, you know, or you know, they're not connected, let's just say, to the burials. I think, you know, our people were buried with the finest things. We all had very different skilled people that had a place in our Chumash villages and our trade system. And we had the most beautiful basket weavers, you know, shell bead money, and, you know, lots of other things. And our medicine people too. So, you know, those are our very unique items that are buried with them. And so when you hear about people that say, oh yeah, my husband's in construction, and, or, you know, we just happen to stumble upon this, while they have like, what, I don't know, hundreds of pieces. Those were burials. Those weren't just left there in deserted village site. You know, those were burial items. And I think that's also important too, to let the general public know, like, be careful what you come across and what you're keeping. Those were meant for someone. That was meant for them. And you know, there's a whole spiritual context to that as well. And I think that's part of this education too, with the general public, about this work that's being done and the importance and the cultural sensitivity.
And that does bring up a really important point, which is, you know, how weird it is that these people have been laid to rest by their family members in the proper ways with a proper send-off, and now you're having to deal with the return, right? So the removal is one trauma. Now you're seeking to have them returned, and you don't even know who these people are. You don't know that you have all of them, because sometimes bodies were split apart. You don't know what they were buried with and who they were during life. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, we just have to deal with the damage that's been done. And I think, you know, with the work that we do, and my cousin Kathy comes along with us as we do reburials. Our two NAGPRA members, Elise Tripp and Ramona Hernandez, have been so great and strong, you know. And, you know, I think it's important to also talk about the emotional piece of this. And you're talking about, you know, it's like, those are our ancestors pulled apart, and who knows where else they are in these higher education institutions. Who knows where else, what other departments they're sharing them amongst for studying purposes. You know, it's so sad. I mean, it's the work there's not enough time, I think, sometimes, There's just not enough time to do this critical work. And the feeling is just genuinely like great sadness to see the destruction that's being done or had been done. And then to go back and some 30 years later, if not more, knowing that they continue to be disrespected and put on shelves and not re-entered into the ground, you know, even whatever we can collect of our ancestors, it's of course we have to do it, you know, knowing that more than likely they're not complete. But you know, should we come across more and hopefully make them complete, that's the best case scenario, you know. And I think that's the work that we're doing with making you know, these different institutions accountable for this work that's being done. It doesn't matter if it was the people that did it a year ago, 5 years ago. There's a name and a place where they've been held all these years, and there had to have been a little bit more responsibility and accountability, and like a whole ethical you know, some type of ethics that that I mean, we as human beings should follow. It's not even, you know, for me, it's about genuine respect for each other. I mean, I don't think it would be a good thing if we went out and start digging up graves right now and taking people's belongings. People are buried with their jewels or, you know, things that they want to go with them. It's the same thing. There's nothing different, you know, all in the sake of, you know, for us or for those people that did it, coming across these mass burials. And what a great find, you know, for these people doing it before the law was put in place. But I wondered, well, what were you thinking? You know, what were you thinking while you're digging up all these graves? I mean, it was just like treasure hunting for them, you know. And then meanwhile, all this time they're sitting up on shelves. So, I mean, I will probably always keep saying that because I was completely floored by seeing the collection that the Phoebe Hearst had up in Berkeley, and being part of some critical work that our elders wanted to ensure happen, as well as our tribal leadership. And, you know, we have some great staff people, Sam Cohen, we have some great people that work with us and really help us navigate the red tape that's been put out there for us to have to go through. And in a lot of cases, lack of cultural sensitivity. So in a lot of ways, I had to really think about and reach deep down inside to kind of like hold back the tears and hold back the emotions, because we need to keep it together, because we got a job to do. We have to bring our ancestors home. We have got to rebury them. They have to be put back, you know, where they came from. Now, in our traditional ways, you know, the soul has gone already. You know, it's already made its way to Shimalakshan, you know, for us. But, you know, it's not okay to take what belonged to them. You know, it's not okay to take their bones. So, you know, when I think about it, you know, that's how I feel, and knowing, and my elders are so strong, and they've done such a great job of just really ensuring that this is happening. And our tribal council, they make sure this happens as well. And that's what you need strong tribal leadership. We need to keep it together. We need to move forward for this critical work. And they've done a fabulous job.
And it does require the financial piece of it.
Yeah, and it makes me feel for those tribes that don't have that financial piece, and having to, you know, there's some great grants out there that you can apply for. But again, I mean, it's, you know, yeah, they were taken, and now we have to pay to get them back. We have to pay for us to go up there to do this work. We have to pay for planes to go to help us take us to these remote locations, so they can get back to where they can get buried as close as they can to where they were taken from. With the information that we have, you know, we do our best to ensure that, because it's important. They need to go as close to home as possible.
This is so critically important, and I really appreciate you sharing. You know, these are conversations you and I have, but it's nice that we can share them with a larger group, so that they can have a better understanding of the sort of the piece that's missing. I think so often when we see this work either in an academic in an academic writing or in some kind of conversation, it's usually from the museum side. And you rarely see tribal folks being able to share the work that they're doing. And in every case is private, obviously, and confidential. So it's really important that we're able to share this at a more, at a large, a higher level, but that way that people can have a better understanding of the level of intensity of this work. And I've been fortunate to work with so many of the cultural resource folks and NAGPRA folks in your tribe over the years, over these decades. And just as you're saying, it's such hard work and it's such an emotional toll. You can't do it some people can't do it for very long at all. It takes a special kind of person to put yourself in that way.
No, and I think, Wendy, it's important to note that it's, you're unique. We don't always encounter people like you and, in that type of work. And I think that should be noted as well. It's like, not to say everybody is difficult to work with, but we have great people like you that really are in the position to support, us getting our ancestors back. It's a partnership. It's a respect. It's, it's a friendship at times too, right? I mean, it's about just mutual respect between each other and really understanding that science isn't the priority here. It's, doing what's right. And so I'm grateful for that. And I just want you to know that as well. You make our work easier, the support and explaining things. I think that's important as well, and I think of those tribes again that don't have as many resources that we have. And, experts like you, it's so important to help them navigate this area. And really what they're focused on is getting the ancestors back, is the reburials. In knowing that there's people like you out there that really do support this is important, and then not making it difficult for us. Because apologies can only go for so long, and it's important they put people like you in these positions to help. And as they're hiring people for these positions, liaisons to tribes, making sure they're the right fit for those positions, making sure they have the right mindset and they understand and respect tribes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm very grateful for the work, and I've certainly enjoyed learning, from so many tribal folks and being able to support this human right. We're gonna go through some of these pretty fast, but it's really just to kind of let people know that that we have a lot of different objects that need to come home. So it's not just about ancestors and the burial remains, but there's also ceremonial objects that have been removed during ethnographic time periods. So we're talking about people like Krober and even Harrington that went into people's homes that were fishing, and they were called abandoned, and then just took everything, took all the regalia, took all the baskets, took them home, brought them into the museum or sold them. And we have these notes that say that this is exactly what they did. So they weren't hiding it. They felt very much entitled to this work. And under NAGPRA, you have to show that you're still using the objects for that ceremony today. So the definitions themselves become the impediment. And we have other objects of cultural patrimony as a final sort of category, which really speak to the idea that you don't necessarily have the right as an individual to sometimes to sell something. And there were definitely times in California's histories where any person who was white could go up to a Native person and take whatever they have, or have them compel them to sell it or trade it or whatever. That compulsion was very much a real thing. And during that time, and of course across the founding of the United States, taking over these native lands during the smallpox epidemics, during starvation and genocidal acts, you see people being more willing to part with items that were not even theirs to part with, whether that is clan objects or regalia or dance materials, I mean, all sorts of things. And so this particular category becomes super important because it acknowledges that it was not removed from the community, from the person with the proper title. And we talk about the sort of foundation of Western law being about property rights and how incongruent this is with sort of traditional native, with many tribal beliefs and customs. So yeah, speeding it along as we are already past the half an hour. We could talk about this for many hours and just get started.
For days,
But,
for days.
Yeah, exactly. This is decades work for a reason. This is just to show you the some of the numbers. It's from 2000, but it's to give you some idea of the quantity of material we're talking about. And I won't go into detail, but I just want you to have a sense of the scope and the magnitude of tribes trying to return so many ancestors that are across so many different museums. And certainly San Ynez has had to deal with this as the Chumash were a favorite for being looted, and just dozens of museums, dozens, and then we go international and see even more. So this is big work. The kinds of hoops that tribes have to go through is to prove cultural affiliation, meaning that they have to demonstrate that they have a shared group identity, and you're allowed to use any of these lines of evidence to prove it. And that's fine. And I will say, as a museum NAGPRA person for 25 plus years, that it's really not difficult to know where ancestral remains came from. If you don't know where they come from, you might know the cultural group, or you might have other indications that will help you get there. But it's very rare that, and it does happen, that you have ancestors looted and their provenience was lost, the contextual information was lost. But more often than not, you know something about the geography. And with that, tribes have that information. They'll help you get to that part if you're the museum side. And that's the most, from my perspective, that has been the most frustrating. And we see this over and over again. Things that are identified as culturally unidentifiable, meaning that they can't figure out which community it should be associated with. But yet, you know where it comes from. You might know some of the cultural objects that it was found with. There's a tribe that will help you figure that out. And that's where we are 30 years later. So much of the ancestors that haven't come home, hundreds of thousands of ancestors haven't gone home because they have been labeled as CUI. And that's the frustration that so many face. This is the second part, and I think we can both say that this is the most frustrating part. At the end of the day, when NAGPRA was first implemented, it was, oh, well, tribes are going to empty out the museums. Nobody's going to be able to do human remains research. We'll never know anything, blah, blah, blah. But the final decision making is with the museum or the federal agency, period. So this is not about the museums having the right to pull up a van and take everything. There's a constant negotiation process by which the tribe is left to convince a person who may not be tribally friendly, or may really want to keep those remains, or may study them. And this is the hardest part of the whole thing. And no matter what we do, at the end of the day, there is a National NAGPRA Review Committee that can make a recommendation. But we come back to the museum getting the final say, or the federal agency getting the final say. So this is really where we see the sort of the difficulty in seeing NAGPRA implemented. Did you have anything you want to add to that, Nakia?
It's very frustrating for that to happen. You know, I guess, I mean, that would be, through all that would be what I would say. It's very frustrating for us to know this back and forth, and then, you know, the decision-making process.
So with that in mind, there have been other sort of implementation of things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is at the UN level, which again is to help people understand that we're talking about human rights, and that Native people across the world should have the opportunity to have their ancestors returned and their cultural items returned with no undue burden. But again, you know, these are not signed. They haven't been passed by Congress in the United States. So we have this sort of pushing, but trying to get people to finally do this work can be really difficult. And this is incredibly important because NAGPRA does not apply to the US territories. So places like Guam, the American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the American Virgin Islands have no recourse for having their ancestors come home. We also don't see anything that allows for slaves that are inside museums to come home. So there's still so many bodies that are left inside these institutions that are not even given NAGPRA. And so we're talking about a process which is itself flawed because it leaves the final decision within the museums, and yet we still have all of these other folks that don't even have that. And we also don't see that non-federally recognized tribes are incorporated within this law. They are reliant upon the help of federally recognized tribes, such as Ynez has done to assist them in bringing their ancestors home. So there's tons of holes. So let's make this clear that we're, especially in places like California, where we have 150 tribes, and more than 60 non-federally recognized tribes, they rely on their cousins for help. We also have an issue, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but we also have an issue where we have no cultural patrimony laws at the federal level that prevent the export of bodies or of cultural items. And without having anything to prevent the export, it's difficult for tribes to request for them to come home. So so we have things like the Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act, which has been introduced since 2016 to try to at least come up with something to prevent the exportation of any further cultural items, especially those that are looted and stolen, and give tribes some recourse for going back to places like France and England and Spain and all of these other places that hold so many important pieces and ancestors. I'm not going to go into UCLA, but I think you have a sense that we have been working with tribes for a long time, and it is very it's been a very important part within especially our American Indian Studies graduate students, faculty, and staff to push since the beginning of NAGPRA to involve federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes, and to make sure that UCLA was always in compliance. So I really walked into a very supportive American Indian Studies department, and also being able to have someone like Diana Wilson, who is the cultural ethnographer, who actually had been working already with California tribes and museum issues for several years. So I was very beneficial. I had a lot of benefit from my predecessors, and so I want to give them a big shout out. And the Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash folks have always been very strong on campus and making sure that their voices were heard, and Wanenu as well. So it is something that I was able to benefit from and walk into with that support. This is what a NAGPRA process flowchart looks like at UCLA. I'm going to sweep by on there, but this is just to give you a visual aid on how difficult this process is. And now we have state law and a new UC repatriation policy, which basically makes it a little more difficult in some ways and a little easier in others. This is what it looks like on campus. I don't do the work just myself. I am very fortunate to have had a very good NAGPRA advisory committee that is filled with Native folks from many tribes, and especially from California. People like Laura Miranda and Cindy Alvitre have been instrumental over the years and decades in their work and assistance. So again, and obviously, people like Freddie Romero and Joe Tagalong have been helpful as well. So, I mean, I can't really give enough credit. It is to all of the folks who have been willing to put up with me and educate me in the process. We are really fortunate at UCLA that we have only 5 ancestral remains left from where we started. And that is in big part due to Sandy Ynez and being willing to support, as well as San Manuel Band of Mission Indians being willing to support 8 non-federally recognized tribes of Chumash, Tongva, and Tataviam coming together in collaboration to claim and assist in the reburial of those ancestors and their cultural items. And that was in conjunction with the Department of Parks and Rec and with the California Department of Transportation, as well as our chancellor setting aside land in a joint area set aside with now under the control of San Ynez for in perpetuity for the reburial of those objects. And as sort of real quickly, just as part of that is what we call like carrying our ancestors home, which was something that we talked about when we were all together. The 150 people who participated in the reburial of those ancestors we can't talk about a particular case, but we can at least bring to light some of the stories that Nakia has shared and so many others for decades that have done this work for more than NAGPRA has existed in trying to protect those ancestors. And so that was the partnership that we took on with those communities, that we would further the education in whatever way we could. You wanna talk a little bit about relationships in like 2 minutes, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. I think that with this work, developing relationships and actually being part of very critical conversations is so important. I mentioned that earlier, but again, Wendy, how many are on our list for repatriation? I mean, 30, if not more. So developing relationships with these different higher education institutions, museums are so important. And again, I can't stress enough having those conversations, but it's important. Really open your ears, listen to what we have to say. And it does change that representation. And this is just, some of the guys that work with our monitoring program. And this changes our representation with our tribal monitors out there looking out for the best interests of the tribe, letting us know when they do come across items that need to be looked into. And I think it's just so important for that to happen. And as our monitors are out there working and doing this work, we want to make sure everyone sees that. The tribes are not going to allow for anything to happen that's not supposed to happen. And I just think that, with my tribal elders, we're changing that representation as well. So, it's like I do work with language and cultural revitalization, reawakening within our people. It's the same thing with this area as well. And, it's so important that our tribal leadership and our elders are part of that table of sitting down and talking, having these conversations, and for them to be heard. We have 2 NAGPRA reps, as I mentioned earlier, and they've done a phenomenal job of getting in there. And we have to be aggressive. Wendy, in one of those slides, I think it was the first repatriation conference. I think it's so cool. We've seen Dennis Banks as one of the speakers. This is what this does. We have to get in there. We have to fight for what is ours. That fight is not over. That was 1993, and this fight is not over. And we can have a nice, good conversation, but there's going to have to be a time where we have to say, no, enough's enough. We're not going to allow this to happen anymore. We're going to exercise our rights. And I would say, that there was times, I'm sure, that tribes have been taken advantage of. And we're not given that opportunity to sit at the table to represent correctly or are quieted down. And as you can see from Wendy's, I I don't know what she would call that, the NAGPRA process, that look crazy, you know, but can you just imagine what that does to the tribes that are trying to enforce this, you know, and make, you know, these institutions accountable for the NAGPRA process. You know, that it's just ridiculous sometimes what we have to go through. And if you don't get cooperation and or the cultural sensitivity, you know, that's when we have to stand up and say, no, enough. This is what's going to happen, or this is going to happen. You know, and it's true though. We have to have those conversations in it, and we have some great people, and I know we have some, I'm sure, hopefully some tribal people in the audience tonight. And I just want to encourage you, you know, I call, you know, some of our tribal attorneys, you know, tribal people taking on these roles of federal attorneys and archaeologists and anthropologists. I mean, these are our modern day warriors. They're being put in place because we need to fight these battles. And we need to have those people that have the cultural sensitivity. They're our own people in there doing some of this critical work, and really helping us out with understanding what needs to be done as well. So, you know, that's why I look to the people that are mentors for me. You know, Wendy, you're a mentor for me. I have elders that are mentors, you know, other tribal friends that are mentors that can explain things a little better. So we understand it is a community of support. And that's where you see where Ynez helps out with non-federally recognized tribes for reburials. And, you know, because we have an obligation. We have an obligation that you don't need to see in writing. It's our Indian way. It's what we need to do to support each other, to make sure these, you know, these atrocities that happen are fixed. We have to make it right for our ancestors. And that's not something you're going to see written, but that's just something we have within each other. That camaraderie, I can't say that name, camaraderie. When you can say it for me, that connection, and you know, just knowing that that's the way we do things, and you know, and then all this other stuff is kind of like, you know, it's just the world that we live in today, and the fact that NAGPRA had to be put in place because of all the wrong that was done before, you know, and not to say some things still aren't happening that aren't wrong, because they still are. You know, we didn't even talk about private property owners and those things that happen there, you know. And when we encounter a private property owner and they invite us out and they, you know, we know for sure it's our ancestors. I mean, what a beautiful thing for them to say, you know what, we want you to take care of your people. You know, they're not going to go cover it up and just act like, you know, nothing happened, but, you know, they invite us out to come handle it and take care of it. And that's really a great thing. And so there are some great people that will reach out and do that and create a relationship with us. And you know, I can name several, but you know, but anyhow, I mean, there are some good people out there that know. And it's not like they had to know NAGPRA. Not like they had to know us as Chumash people, but they did it because that's just the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And it's your human rights, you know, human respect, you know, for one another.
That's such a great place to leave it.
Yes. So successful collaborations, we're talking about tribes are real partners. We're talking tribes are involved from the beginning, and their thoughts are heard, incorporating fully, not partially, or being screened. Screening us is not okay. Having cultural sensitivity is acknowledged and practiced at all levels. So when we go into these spaces, you know, Johnny over here completely knows and loves us and respects us. And then Susie over here is kind of like, she's kind of on board, but not really. But she's here to do her job, right? Well, you know, this is a sacred space. They're responsible for our people, our ancestors. And so cultural sensitivity is very important. That's why I mentioned when, you know, when these jobs are being filled, I think that should be a criteria. You know, do they really understand and know what this job entails and that they're dealing with tribal communities? Decision making in projects are culturally appropriate. Reports and presentations are co-authored. That would be a great shift, I think, because, you know, again, tribes are part of that narrative. We're part of, and that is if there's things that we want to be part of. You know, there are some sensitive areas and we're hoping they'll respect that. Well, we don't think that should be written about. We don't think that should be out there in that way. Tribes receive some level of benefits from the efforts. So, you know, it makes me think about, you know, whatever they were studying, you know, reports aren't just shared freely. I mean, you have to go ask for them. And you have to find out, well, you know, what were their conclusions of, you know, whatever, and we hate to say it, but, you know, as they were studying our ancestors, but what were the, is that shared with us? No, it's not always shared with us. So I think, Wendy, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, guys. We do have some really good questions that came in. So we have a few on the Q&A section and then a few on the chat box. Did you guys want me to read those to you, or did you want to look through and check?
Sure. Do you want to read those now, Wendy? What do you think?
So do you want to answer them all? Can you see them, Nakia?
Are we in the Q&A?
You can look in the Q&A first.
Okay. Okay.
Obviously, Deb Haaland becoming Secretary of the Interior is going to be awesome, no matter what. And hopefully it would have some changes for NAGPRA.
Yeah, you know, I hate to put too much pressure on her, but, you know, it's pretty historical, but politics are politics. And I think she's going to have a lot of fighting to do in her position, being a Native woman there. What are your thoughts about materials that document sacred objects, especially photographs, such as information from archaeological surveys when these items were stolen? Photographs of funeral objects, maps, and burial locations.
So the associated field documents.
What are your thoughts about the material? Well, I mean, I think if we had a choice, we would have said not to photograph any of our ancestors or their belongings. But I'll have to tell you, it's not like those photographs are being shared with us anyways as well. So it's not, I mean, I deal with these items, but it's not public information. So I think that sometimes we have to go back to those documents to get a full picture and exactly know where they come from. But it's not something that's public information. So I would absolutely be against that. Like I said, there's people still out there doing this type of work. They're still out there digging and doing things they're not supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I've had tribes basically, it depends. Again, so many of these things are kind of very tribally specific. So it depends on what it's documenting. If it's your run of the mill kind of like field, you know, like leveling and field notes, and there's a burial that is on there, then the tribe should have a say over how it's distributed or cared for, or if it needs to be returned, especially if the entire collection's been returned. But there are other items or other things that are documented, such as ceremonies. That's pretty important material. And probably, you know, some tribes would want it to come home. Some would want it to be restricted from other tribal members. So there are restrictions around who can seize certain things.
Why do you believe so many Native American bones were stolen for trophies, sacredness, etc.? Well, I think some people take things as trophies because we know those are happening now. You know, Channel Islands Park Service has just asked us not too long ago, you know, what can we do to help prevent people from taking things? And again, I would think people would it's common sense not to take, especially human bones. And our items that, you know, clearly weren't just, you know, there just because. But I definitely think people are taking things and they very well know what they're doing. And I don't know, I have more to add to that, etc., but I won't say why they're taking it. But you know, they're not doing it in a good way, because I just think that there's just no excuse for that, especially when it comes to human remains. I don't know, Wendy, if you have anything to say about that.
Agreed.
Okay. All right.
So over in the chat,
There's a few questions in the chat box.
Okay.
yeah. I see so many friends that are here, so it's really nice.
Well, I think the very first one that asks about once remains or ceremonial objects, artifacts have been recovered or returned, do you attempt to return them to the original location? Yes, we do. We do our best. But, you know, that's not always an option, especially if those areas have been purchased by, you know, it could be private land, it can be where a building is now or an airport. I won't say which airport, but, you know, there can be, you know, something in that area. So we do the best we can to get them as close as we can to where they need to go. And again, our NAGPRA reps, you know, they're part of that decision making. They're part of, you know, helping us navigate those issues that come up. And that's so important that this is not just me, it's my elders council, it's our NAGPRA committee. And, you know, thought goes into where we should be, you know, taking the ancestors back once we have them. So I think I answered that. Oh, a comment from Freddie. Hi, Freddie. Thank you for watching us. Freddie's the person that was here doing this work before. Thank you for all the work he did while he was here. Laid down a great foundation for us.
Yo, and a shout out from Mona.
Oh, Mona Tucker.
Woo!
Hatu. Yeah, these are great people that are part of this work. They're tribal leaders. They know the struggle. They know the pain.
Yeah.
And
so and then thank you to everybody who wrote in, and we assured, you know, I love you. So it's nice to have so many folks on here. And Mary, we see Mary Lopez Kiefer and Lori Sisquak and Karima. So really quickly, thoughts about NAGPRA.
Yeah.
That's you. Oh, I was hoping I could avoid this. Way to look at 7:03.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah. So NAGPRA, this was sort of, we were talking about sort of state entities like UC Berkeley who were not good at following NAGPRA. So in 2003, we had NAGPRA was created to help push to provide some more legislative force. And unfortunately, it was unfunded and it was never promulgated. So there was no money set in to make it active. And that changed a few years ago. And the work of that was given to the Native American Heritage Commission. And they had to come up with rules and they've had to come up with guidelines. And to support that work, AB 2836 and AB 275 have passed. Many of them are sort of are forward facing to the UC and has requirements, which we have been implementing. And you'll see that in a new UC interim policy, which was enacted last year. But there's a lot more work to be done. And it applies to state entities at the biggest part of this. So we're going to see a lot more work being carried out. It gives more, it gives tribes more leverage to be able to identify what are cultural objects and are considered NAGPRA or NAGPRA eligible. So hopefully we'll see some good things come from that. Of course, my gut feeling is that NAGPRA can get you there if you want to be there. So it's unfortunate that the states have had to the tribes have had to create state legislation and in order to try to push entities to do what they're supposed to be doing under NAGPRA. and it's still being worked out. So to be continued.
Another area to navigate. Okay, I think that's all of our.
We had one question come in from Facebook. I put it in the chat box. Was, as an archaeological student at CSU Channel Islands, I want to be more involved with NAGPRA. How does one get started in that community?
That's tough. You can reach out to Colleen Delaney or Jennifer Perry, who are both professors at CSU Channel Islands, and find out what's going on with NAGPRA at your campus. And that's probably where I would start, since that's right there.
So to close up, I just would like to say, I always give acknowledgement, and it's so important for me to acknowledge my tribe. Again, I'm just here representing my tribe. I am a Samala Chumash woman that was asked to get involved with this work. And it's something that I take very seriously, and I'm became to be more aware of the issue that's out there and the work that needs to get done. Wendy's been great help to me. For those that are part of the museum community, open your doors, let the people be part of these conversations, allow them to go see the artifacts you have, allow them to, if they can, hold them and, show respect, allow them to sing to these objects, allow them to pray, allow them to help make peace with what the wrong that's been done. And help support us in our work of reclaiming our identity, our traditional ways of making things. And, this is so important. And, and it's good that we do this work, all of us, in a good way, with a good heart. And I can't express that even more, and how that really helps us. It makes us feel welcome in a space that we weren't always welcomed in, and allowing our elders to see things that they've never seen before. That's everything. That's language, that's any historical papers, anything that can help us piece the puzzle together to complete our stories that we have and continue this journey. I think that's so important. So, if you are in those positions, make a difference. Make a difference and open the doors, and, we will come. We'll come flooding through, and you're going to help our people. You're going to help our elders before they leave this earth to connect to objects and information that they've never had the opportunity to have before. So, I mean, that's my sentiment. That's my feeling. That's my heart. And hopefully other tribal people know that too, and I know they know that because they're wanting that as well. So let's just keep that forward momentum going and allow us to do the work we need to do. So with that said, thank you so much, Chumash Indian Museum.
Thank you guys both so much for this really powerful conversation. I think it was really important to have this public forum on that. For anyone who tuned in a little bit late, we will have this full recording on our YouTube channel in just a couple days. We try to get it up as soon as possible. I will send a link out to everyone who RSVP'd with that YouTube as well. Nakia and Wendy, you'll get a copy of that YouTube as well in case you want to share it with students or friends or families or anything. Again, thank you both so much. Wendy, I know it's pretty late for you in Florida. I'll let you guys go. Again, thank you everyone so much for tuning in. Keep an eye out on our museum's website for further information on any more events, virtual or when the museum gets to open and things like that. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you again so much.
Alishta Hatton.